Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay, super. Okay. Well, good morning, good evening, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining Aprovecho's very first webinar in this our spring webinar series sponsored by the Osprey Foundation. I'm Nordica MacCarty. I'm an associate professor at Oregon State University and executive director at Aprovecho. And I've been involved in the clean cooking sector for about 26 years now. And so really happy to be continuing to work with all of you wonderful people around the world in supporting clean cooking globally. Recently, I've been learning more about carbon financing through the folks who are developing the CLEAR methodology. And so we recently put out a survey to many of you and asked what you're most interested in learning about from us. We've got this wonderful grant from the Osprey Foundation to support the labs and projects around the world. And so in this survey, we asked people, what are you looking to learn about? And one of the number one things that people wanted more information about was carbon financing and how it works and how we can get involved and support that important part of our sector. So our first webinar will be on that topic. Today, I'll plan to just give us a general overview, kind of a 101 for those of you who aren't familiar with how carbon accounting works at all, and just kind of talk about what the purpose is, and then talk about the different options that we have for methodologies and the measurements we need to make, and then go into details of the new CLEAR methodology, which is appears to be very close to being accepted by the governing bodies. So hopefully that's the one that's most relevant for all of you and your projects. And hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for some questions and answers. But if you have some questions in the meantime, quick questions, feel free to use the raise your hand function in Google Meet, and maybe we can pause and answer those questions in real time. And I do want to acknowledge my good friend and colleague, Alyssa Derby from the Clean Cooking Alliance and one of the authors of CLEAR, as many of these slides are hers from Ethos 2026 this year, when she delivered the Carbon 101 session. So she did such a nice job on that. I just borrowed some of her content and with her blessing. So, all right, so we'll get started. So first off, what exactly are carbon credits? So essentially what we're trying to do with carbon accounting is to recognize that before we go into a community and we implement a clean cooking project, the baseline methods are emitting a certain amount of emissions. And ideally those emissions before we come in with a new project are higher than they would be after we come in and implement a clean cooking project. And so if we can quantify the emissions before the project and then the emissions after, the difference in those is what's called the emission reductions. We try to account for that as CO2e. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so why is this important? It's really a major opportunity for our sector. This chart is showing the global carbon market growth over the past couple of decades and the projections for the future. And this is not just for clean cooking, this is the whole global carbon market size by year, but we can see that it's been slowly building, and in the next 5 years, it's expected to even almost even double from where it's at now. And that's with the Paris Agreement and the other international agreements that are coming online. So we're seeing a lot of interest in and greater number of commitments and interest from buyers. And it's a really great opportunity for us to get clean cooking scaled globally. But there's a challenge that we have to address, and that's that recently there was a lot of scrutiny in the carbon credits generated in clean cooking, as well as all of the other carbon markets, right? We're, as a global community, we're wanting to ensure that this method of trading emissions reductions is accurate and that people are getting the value that they're paying for. And so an article came out in 2024 that claimed that the projects that had been receiving carbon credits so far were overcrediting by something like 9 or 10 times. Now, there was a lot of issues people brought up about this article, and whether or not this was perfectly accurate or not, there's a lot to be debated. But the issue is that it brought up the concerns that our methodologies and the ways that we are calculating our carbon credits in Cookstove projects maybe were not as accurate as they needed to be, and so we needed to do some work on that. And so as a community, we came together and have really been trying to address that, and things are moving forward well, I think. And so at the essence of that was the different methodologies that people were using for calculating the carbon credits. And methodologies are essentially the rules for how we measure and monitor and count our carbon credits and our emission reductions. And so the Cookstove carbon methodologies that have been in use prior to now are by organizations such as the UNFCCC, the Gold Standard, and Vera. You can see the names of these methodologies on the right-hand side. And so there's a lot of methodologies which created, each one a little bit different and for different applications. And so that created some confusion and some choices between different methodologies and various levels of challenge there. And so to address this issue of potential overcrediting, as well as the challenges and confusion with the multiple methodologies, a group called 4C has developed the comprehensive lowered emission assessment and reporting methodology, which is called the CLEAR methodology for cooking energy transitions. And so I want to be really clear that this is not yet adopted, but it's looking really good that all things are moving forward towards being adopted soon, hopefully. So this is really good news for our sector. Okay, so how does CLEAR work, and how do we work with the methodologies? So essentially what we're trying to do when we're working with a carbon credit methodology is quantify the emission reductions, right? And so like on the earlier slide, what we're trying to do is figure out what were our emissions of CO2e at the baseline, and then what happens when we implement a new stove and people are using it and they're saving fuel, hopefully, and they're producing emissions at the project level. And so if we can subtract the project emissions from the baseline emissions, then that gives us our emission reductions. And that's what turns into our carbon credits. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do. So the way that we determine those emission reductions is recognizing that the emissions at either the baseline or the project are equal to the energy consumption in the households times the emission factors of the CO2 and the other products of incomplete combustion when that energy is consumed. So how we measure that energy consumption is where kind of a lot of the debate was coming into, and some of the criticisms. And so energy consumption, the previous way that we measured that in some of the methodologies was to assume that the energy consumption in the project stove was equal to the energy that was consumed at the baseline stove times the ratio of the efficiencies of the baseline stove to the project stove. So basically thinking, okay, we're consuming 100 kilograms of wood in the baseline with the traditional pre-stone fire, and maybe our new stove is twice as efficient as our old stove. Well, then we're going to cut our emissions in half. That's kind of how that worked, but it didn't actually measure. It didn't require people to measure what the actual energy consumption was in the household with the new stove. And so there's a lot of criticism on that, and I'll talk about why in a second. And so the new method and a better method is to actually measure the project energy consumption with the kitchen performance test, or to use continuous tracking. Talk about those two options as we go forward. So before we do that, I just wanted to talk about the spectrum of Cookstove testing, right? There's a lot of different tests that we have that we can use in our toolbox of how we understand stove performance, so that we can design stoves and so that we can understand how they're performing in the field. And there's a whole range of what those are appropriate for and when. So in the lab, when we're trying to design a stove and really optimize, the heat transfer and the combustion efficiency, we do that under really controlled conditions, so that we can compare, easily compare one design versus the next in terms of its actual physical performance and its characteristics. And for that, we use the water boiling test, WBT, and ISO. And that's under really controlled conditions with, the same fuels, the same pots, same amount of water, same kind of firepower levels. And so that gives us really good insights for design and tells us the thermal efficiency. Then as we're moving toward what that means when people are using them, we do things like the controlled cooking test and the uncontrolled cooking test. And that is when we're cooking real meals, using the pots that are appropriate for those meals and the firepower levels that are appropriate for those meals. And then we're starting to get an idea of fuel consumption per task. Now, if we want to get to something like how much fuel are we saving per day, that's what people are just doing what they would normally do in their home. And that's when we use the kitchen performance test. And that accounts for, when they're making tea and for breakfast and, ugali for lunch or dinner and beans and tortillas and all the things that people eat throughout the day. And so that's really what we need to get at is what is the fuel consumption per day in a household in the uncontrolled conditions where we're not telling them what pots to use or what fuels to use or how to cook their food. And so there's a place for all of these tests, but the message is that in the controlled conditions in the lab, that's going to give us a different kind of performance indicators than the uncontrolled performance in the field, which is what we're trying to get at when we're calculating carbon credits. And so just a reminder, hopefully many of you have done like water boiling tests and ISO tests. What we are looking at in the lab is the thermal efficiency, which is essentially the amount of energy that gets into the pot that we can measure based on the temperature rise of the water relative to the energy that went into the fire or the energy that was released by the fuel. And so that's a pretty straightforward thermodynamic equation. But it's important to recognize that the results of the thermal efficiency are specific to the pot that you're using, how wide it is, what material it is, those sorts of things, the fuel that you're using, how moist it is, the firepower, tending practice, and so on. And so that's not ideal from a carbon credit standpoint, primarily because the lab does not predict the field, right? Using the standard pots and standard fuels is not representative of the many different cooking tasks that people work through during the day and the many diverse ways that they take fire and the different kinds of fuels that they're using. It's also, you can optimize thermal efficiency in the lab with a wide pot and careful tending and things, and that's not necessarily what's being done in the field. Also, a problem with using thermal efficiency for carbon accounting is that it's measured from as few as 5 tests in a lab by one technician doing it. And while thermal efficiency is related to the fuel consumption that we see in the households, it's not the best metric because of those reasons. And so for carbon accounting, we really want to stay away from thermal efficiency. And so CLEAR is really pushing for using the KPT or the kitchen performance test. And this is much better because it requires a large sample of households to achieve 95% confidence, statistical confidence regarding the change in fuel consumption, and therefore the emission reductions between the baseline and the project stove. And that sample means that it's a minimum of 100 households are sampled for CLEAR, and those are randomly sampled, so we're not controlling who's actually running the stoves, and that's 4 days per household. So 100 households times 4 days times three meals per day, that's over 1,000 samples that we're relying on instead of those potentially just the 5 samples in the lab. And what's also exciting about the KPT is that it can be paired with sensors and surveys to actually track the technology use and the number of people eating. So we'll talk about the digital KPT as well in just a few minutes. Oops. Oh, I guess the digital KPT is here. So so the digital KPT, it's not required that we use the digital version, but it can be helpful because it requires less staff time and provides a verifiable data log. And that's one of the things that a lot of the carbon projects value and the buyer's value is that we have this verifiable data that's very transparent and has a record. So using the digital KPT, you can use a number of sensors. You can mix and match these, but the main one that people use for the digital KPT is called a SUMS, or a stove use monitors. And these record when the stove is being used based on temperature. So you can see some image on the right. There's a couple of them, like the Geocene Dot or the Climate Solutions Consulting Exact sensors. These are different options for ways that we can track the body of the body temperature of the stove, so that we understand when it's being used and when it's not being used. And usage, as we'll see, is a big part of carbon accounting. So that really helps a lot because it gives us an insight into what's happening in the home. Because we also need to know changes in energy consumption, it can also be helpful to use a fuel sensor, which was developed in my lab at OSU and is available from Climate Solutions Consulting. And the fuel sensor essentially, hangs in a household near the stove, and you basically hang the household's fuel supply from the sensor and just ask that people put the fuel on the fuel sensor before they put it into the stove. And so it's just hanging near the stove, and then they just take the fuel off the sensor as they need it to fuel their stove. And so then you actually get a log of when people are cooking and how much fuel they're putting into their stove. And when you pair this with the exact temperature sensor, you can verify cooking events between the temperature and the fuel sensor. So then we're getting some really some strong confidence in our data and our understanding of fuel consumption and stove usage. And then another exciting thing is people are starting to install IoT sensors, or Internet of Things. And these are sensors that can be installed in stoves, like pellet stoves, or I know some of the electric induction cookers, potentially the electric pressure cookers, have these IoT sensors installed inside of the stoves. And these report back via mobile data when these stoves are being used. And so then we can continuously track energy consumption and usage, and use that in our carbon accounting for the metered methodology, or now called the CTEC, continuously tracked energy consumption. So we've got a lot of good new technologies that are helpful in that respect. Okay, so now let's talk about the CLEAR methodology. So the number one goal of the CLEAR methodology is to reduce that overcrediting that we talked about earlier, or at least the concern of overcrediting, and be conservative in our estimates, but not overly conservative. We're trying to get to the accuracy, right? We don't want to be too conservative such that we're limiting investment in these projects and undercounting our carbon credits, but we don't want to be overstating our carbon credits either. So the CLEAR authors have gone through so many public commenting opportunities and so many iterations on really trying to get at what is the best practice and the best science to get conservative but more accurate values. Another goal is that we're trying to reduce the number of methodologies that are needed for different types of projects, such that this one would cover all the types of projects that are out there. So that would include the continuously tracked projects, like when we have fuels that people are purchasing and we can track how much energy they're using things like the IoT sensors that I mentioned for electricity, or if they're purchasing ethanol from like kiosks where they have a household account, and so that's tracked, or people are buying LPG or pellets. And so anytime we have a distribution system where energy consumption to a household can be monitored through purchases, that's called continuously tracked, or CTEC. Continuously tracked energy consumption is what CTEC stands for, and that's the replacement for what used to be called the metered methodology. So it has to be tracked at the household level, and then it can be used, and then we'll talk about how to calculate the energy consumption after in a minute. And then for non-CTEC stoves, so the stoves that are not metered, which is what the more traditional stoves like wood and charcoal stoves, CLEAR requires a KPT for those. And the ISO standard in the laboratory fuel efficiency, thermal efficiency from the lab is only used to meet minimum qualifications for thermal efficiency. So that only stoves that have like a 35% efficiency are allowed to even apply for carbon credits. But then the KPT is used to calculate the emission reductions. And so generally, when we're doing these kind of carbon accounting projects, the projects themselves are conducting the monitoring, but our vision is that hopefully the regional testing and knowledge centers and the labs can help. And if we can provide trained enumerators for these projects, that might help make things more efficient and productive for everybody. So we at Aprovecho are happy to help support the RTKCs in learning about how to do these kind of KPTs and monitoring to support projects in their communities. And so again, just a reminder, CLEAR is not yet adopted, but it hopefully will be soon. It seems like gold standard and some of the others are very close to making that happen. Okay, so this is another slide from Alyssa that just really summarizes the difference between CTEC and non-CTEC projects and what inputs are needed to estimate the emission reductions and how we are going to determine it. So as mentioned, the baseline and project fuel consumption are some of the most important metrics that get at our emission reductions. And so for the non-CTEC projects, so the wood and charcoal projects, the baseline fuel consumption is measured using either a global default that is made available by CLEAR. So that's conservative. If you choose to use it, you don't have to do an expensive KPT, but you're going to maybe probably get a little bit fewer carbon credits. And then the project fuel consumption has to be measured by a KPT for the CTEC or the non-CTEC projects. Now for the right-hand side, for the CTEC projects, the baseline fuel consumption can either be measured with a baseline KPT, or it can be back calculated from the project data using fuel consumption ratios derived from the controlled cooking test. So we'll look at the math for that in a little bit, but essentially the option is if you don't want to have to, the project's fuel consumption is continuously tracked, right? It's metered by the stove, right? Through the IoT sensor or the pellet sales or the ethanol sales, that sort of thing. So you don't have to measure the project fuel consumption unless you want to and you choose to do a project KPT, but you can use either the metered information or a project KPT. If you have that metered information, you can take the ratio of the specific fuel consumption between the project stove and the baseline stove and use that to calculate what your stoves were using in the traditional stoves we're using in the baseline. And that requires 5 cooks through doing 3 tests each of the baseline and the project stove. So it's a bit less expensive to do that measurement and a bit less time consuming, but it is another alternative to the baseline KPT. So that's the summary of kind of how we're doing those measurements between the non-CTEC projects and the CTEC projects. And then another thing is CLEAR accounts for the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect is what occurs when people are behaving differently because they're being monitored. And so, for example, if you're doing a KPT with your project stove and people know that they're being monitored, perhaps they're going to use your project stove more during the KPT than they would if they weren't being monitored. So the idea is that if you are using the stove usage monitors to actually measure how much people are using the stove, then you can use that usage that was measured with the sensors. If you're not, and if you're just using surveys, you need to reduce your emission reductions by 25% because that is just to account, being conservative to account for the Hawthorne effect if you're not using those sensors. And so it's trying to give some incentive to use those traceable usage sensors to have more rigorous data on how much people are using the project stove. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit more to the equations behind those carbon emission reductions accounting. But before we jump into the math, I just wanted to see if there's any big questions at the moment on kind of this approach. Feel free to unmute and just ask a question if you have one. Otherwise, I can save Q&A for the end.
Nordica, what is the basic representative sample for AKPT?
Good question. I'll have a slide on that shortly, so we'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so maybe I'll just go ahead and then we can have questions at the end. Okay, so let's start with the non-CTEC stove. So that's the wood and charcoal stoves. How do we actually measure and account for those emission reductions in detail? So,
hello?
Yes, hello? Derek?
The UCT sounds a bit more like the KPT. Okay, based on what I was interpreting. Because the UCT, the uncontrolled, you're not dictating anything to the user. And it's of course, it can be done in the field. So I'm kind of trying to see how, if you could really elaborate on how it differentiates the law with the KPT itself. Because at least for the CCT, it's very clear. And for the UCT, if you could briefly.
Yeah, that's a great question, Derek. So the UCT, which is the uncontrolled cooking test, or the UCET, which is the uncontrolled cooking efficiency test, none of those are appropriate for carbon accounting because those are just focused on a single meal, and there's a lot of variability there. And so the CCT was chosen for this CTEC methodology because there's a bit more, you can get more statistically significant understanding and data from the comparing a single meal on the baseline versus the improved stove. And you can get some good confidence there to use for that back calculation. But the uncontrolled cooking tests would require much larger sample sizes to be able to do that back calculation. So unfortunately, neither of those methodologies are going to be appropriate for carbon accounting. Now, those are really useful for design and for understanding how the stove is working for people and how it performs differently for different types of meals, but not suitable for the methodologies.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, Derek. Okay, so great, thanks for the question. So back to the non-CTEC. Fuel consumption is what we're really trying to get at. And so we have baseline, and we have to understand fuel consumption at the baseline and the project, right? And so there's two options. In option one, you do a baseline KPT and a project KPT. And that's great that you're doing those measurements in the household, both before and after you introduce the stove. And that's some really good, robust data. The issue is that the other option is you could use a global default for the baseline and then do a KPT for the project. And that would save you some time and money from doing the two KPTs, but you might get a little bit lower of a emission reductions. And so this is a great graph on the right here that shows for fuel wood, the appropriate values that you'll get in tons of wood per person per year. And that shows that, if you can do a KPT, but if it's showing that you're getting more than 1 ton per person per year, you're going to have to do a little bit of extra work to make sure that that data is verifiable. And that'll be a little bit more scrutinized. It's going to be capped at 2 tons per person per year. So there's no possibility of getting more than 2 tons per person per year. But if it's between 1 and 2, it's going to be scrutinized, but still possible. Below 1 is kind of more what's expected and in line, and is not going to be causing any trouble. And so otherwise, you can do 0.5 ton per year as your baseline without even doing any measurements. And so that's kind of how that works for fuel wood. And then for charcoal, it's similar, although different values there. So it just shows the different options that you can apply for your baseline fuel consumption per person per year in the households. Okay, so for non-CTEC projects, we'll get into the math here. I'm going to go through it a little bit quickly, but it's just, the goal is just to show you kind of what measurements and assumptions and numbers go into actually calculating the emission reductions. So the emission reductions per year here is calculated as the baseline emissions per year minus the project emissions per year, like we've talked about before. And then we also have to add this factor accounting for the leakage, which is like, I think CLEAR calls for a 2% here. So we take a 2% off there, and that accounts for if reducing the project emissions here is actually causing an increased emission in emissions elsewhere. And that's just kind of a standard thing to include leakage. So you don't have to worry about the leakage. What we want to worry about is how do we calculate the baseline emissions. So the baseline emissions each year is the sum of.
Oh, I changed my mind right now.
Laser, could you?
Hey, she said, eh.
Okay. Okay, yeah, anybody who's not on mute, please go ahead and mute so that we don't have the background noise. Okay, so baseline emission is the sum of the energy consumption in each household at the baseline. That's the energy consumption, so the amount of energy that we measure with the KPT being used in each household. And then that's measured by, or multiplied by, the fraction of non-renewable biomass, which we'll talk about in a minute, times the emission factor of carbon dioxide. So that's how much carbon dioxide is released per megajoule of energy consumed, times the amount of how renewable the trees are, the fuel is being harvested. And then that's also added to the non-CO2 emission factors for things like CO and N2O. And then that also, then to that we add the upstream emissions at the baseline. And so upstream emissions are for things like charcoal, when we talk about the charcoal conversion efficiency, and the fact that there are emissions that are released before we get to the household. So this first part of the equation is the emissions that are released in the household, and this is the upstream emissions that took to get the fuel to the households, like turning wood into charcoal. See, the energy consumption is measured. So this factor here is measured by the non-tracked energy consumption that we measured in the household with the KPT, times the household size, which is HSB, times the project technology days per year. So that's the fraction, that's essentially the usage. What percent of the time are people using the stove? And yeah, the project technology days, then that's measured using the usage and the sums in the household. And those also then apply at the project to understand the project emissions in a household each year when we give the project stove. And so that's the same sort of equation here, where we have the energy consumption that we measure in the project times the emissions of CO2 and the non-CO2 gases, plus the upstream emissions, and then plus any electricity that's consumed when we are in our project stove. And so we're accounting for those as well. Okay, so a little bit about FNRB. So that's the fraction of non-renewable biomass, and essentially what that's trying to do is recognize that when we burn wood, that carbon, it goes into the atmosphere, but theoretically all of that carbon is reabsorbed by a tree that is growing to replace it. And so in a perfectly renewable situation, all the carbon that's emitted in CO2 that's emitted into the atmosphere is reabsorbed and put into the tree. And so we're not adding any net carbon to the atmosphere. However, in situations where the fuel harvest is not renewable, and we're pushing, there's a little bit of deforestation, we have to recognize that only that portion of the carbon dioxide that's emitted is not going to be reabsorbed by the tree. So it's important to understand the fraction of non-renewable biomass and apply that to our CO2 emission factor so that we recognize that some of the CO2 is being reabsorbed, but not all of it. And as you might expect, this is very complex to understand because we really want it to be on a as local, granular basis as possible. So it should be community specific because it's if you're doing a project in Lilongwe, you want to understand how the fuel harvest is, whether it's renewable or how much of it is renewable near Lilongwe. It doesn't matter what's happening in South America. So there are people working very diligently on figuring out how we can calculate this accurately. And it's a really important metric because it's a big part of these equations, right? It's, 100% here would give a high number, whereas 20% would make our emissions reductions quite a bit lower. So the FNRB has a huge impact on the emission reductions that we're counting. And right now, the way that CLEAR prescribes that we do that is using the software called MOFIS. And that has a whole lot of complex geospatial models behind it. I am not an expert in MOFIS, but and you don't need to be either, but just wanted to acknowledge that that is where that number comes from. It's not something that we need to measure for our projects, but it's something that we can look up and we can work with scientists to determine on a community by community basis. So the things that we do measure in these equations are the usage at the household level during the KPT and the energy consumption at the household level during the KPT. The rest of these numbers come from databases or things like MOFIS. So these emission factors come from baseline or from databases. Sorry, the emission factors come from databases, and so does the FNRB. And so there's really, of this equation, there's only essentially two things that we measure in the households themselves. And we do that with the KPT or the other methods that I mentioned. And so Derek was asking earlier about the KPT sample sizes. And so thanks, Derek, that's a really important question. So for CLEAR, they recommend that the minimum sample size is 100 KPTs per project and 200 surveys. So the KPTs are actually going in and measuring the fuel consumption for 4 days. And then the surveys are asking things about number of people cooked for and household size and those things. So that's the minimum there. And for projects of 25,000 or more, so then you need to start increasing your sample size a bit. So even if you had a project of only 1,000 stoves, you would still need to do 100 KPTs. It's unlikely that a project would be that small because there's so much accounting and paperwork that goes along with carbon credits, but just recognizing that 100 KPTs is the minimum. And then as you go higher than 25,000, the size increases, but not by much, right? So at 250,000 households, so 10 times that, we would have 213 KPTs required and 313 surveys. And then they still have to do some statistical analysis to demonstrate that it meets the precision threshold in terms of the uncertainty the variability between households. But that's all available in the methodology itself. And then another thing to think about is that as you're implementing stoves in batches, over the years, that sample gets distributed over your age groups. And so at the baseline, this table shows that at the baseline, you need to do 100 stoves, right? You need 100 kpts at your baseline. But then if you distribute, 10,000 or 100,000 stoves in year one, you would need to do a kpt on 100 of those. If by year two, you've done 100,000, you distributed 100,000 stoves in year one and another 100,000 stoves in year two, then you want to do half and half of your KPT so that you do 50 households for the first batch of stoves and 50 households for the second batch of stoves, and so on. Similarly for the year three. So they should be stratified proportionally across those so that your performance and your usage estimates reflect the ages of the cook stoves in the project. Okay, and so we saw that those that usage was a part of that what we needed to measure, and so the way that we do that is through sums or surveys to determine our project technology days. To be eligible to claim up to 90% of the maximum project technology days, if you are not using the sensors, it's assumed that you're only getting, you can only apply 75% of what you got for the maximum project technology days. Because this is, again, trying to incentivize using sensors to indicate usage. If you want more than 75%, there's some customer support actions that you can take in terms of follow-up and other supporting activities so that you can earn a bit more of the usage in project technology days if you're not using the sums. But essentially, the idea is to use sums if possible to get the maximum usage that you can and to really understand how much people are actually using those stoves. And then as far as we talked about the Hawthorne effect, you can also use sums to actually determine the Hawthorne effect. And so instead of reducing your emission reductions by 25% to account for Hawthorne, if you can actually demonstrate that the Hawthorne effect wasn't as significant as 25%, you can actually use that by monitoring for 30 continuous days before and or after the 4-day KPT. So that's kind of getting a little bit into the weeds, but the takeaway from this slide is to get the most possible credit for your emission reductions in terms of usage, you want to use the sums for 30 days around your KPT for the project stove. And then hopefully you'll show a lot of usage in the stove and be able to get those credits accordingly. Okay, so that was for the non-CTEC, like the wood and charcoal stoves. Now let's talk about CTEC. So again, that's when we're tracking energy consumption at the household level by knowing, the electricity consumption, or tracking the LPG sales to that household, ethanol or pellet sales to that household specifically, but it has to be per household. And so with CTEC stoves, we don't need to measure the cooking events, so there's no need for sums. And that's because all of the energy consumption is tracked through the fuel sales, like pellets, ethanol, or LPG, or metering. And then the project emissions, PE, like we were looking at previously, is the tracked energy consumption times that same FNRB times the CO2 plus the emission factor of the non-CO2 plus the upstream emissions. And so that's the same equation as before, just using the tracked energy consumption instead of being measured by the KPT. In the case of an electric stove, there's not going to be, straightforward emission factors of CO2 and non-CO2. And so we can just calculate the project emissions from the source of the electricity, whether it's the grid or off-grid. electrical supply. So that's helpful for that as well. And those again are all available from databases, not something that we have to measure. The only thing that we're measuring is the tracked energy consumption through those metered records. For the baseline then, that's where it gets a little bit more nuanced. We can either back calculate the baseline emissions or baseline energy consumption using 15 controlled tests between 5 cooks and 3 repetitions per stove. I guess that's technically 5 CCTs with 5 cooks. So the energy consumption then for the baseline would be what we measured at for the project times the ratio of the specific consumption between the baseline and the project stove. Or we can do a baseline KPT. And so and in this way, we're just comparing the baseline, the energy that we used for the project stove that would have been used for those cooking processes. And any other non-project cook stoves that are used in the scenario are ignored. And so the baseline fuel consumption calculation only includes that which is displaced by the cook stove. So it simplifies things a bit. And so basically, if you're cooking tea on your electric stove, your baseline would have only, we only account for the energy that you were using to cook tea on your baseline stove. And so the CCT that we could use, and if we wanted to do the CCT instead of the baseline KPT to save money and time and whatever, would be choosing 5 cooks, where each cook prepares the exact same meal 3 times on the traditional stove and 3 times on the new stove. And all 5 of these cooks are preparing that same meal. So for each of those cooks, we figure out the ratio between the specific fuel consumption at the baseline and the project. And then we take the average of those. And that's how we get that ratio of specific consumption to back calculate what we would have used at the baseline. And so those meals must be the same quantities each time and the same recipe for all 5 cooks. And that meal should be chosen to be most representative of what is used and cooked most frequently in that community. And so that's CCTs, take less time than KPTs and are relatively straightforward. You don't need a lot of time or sensors or anything to do the CCTs. So this is a nice option, and still quite a bit better than using the ratio of thermal efficiency, because it's actually based on cooking a real meal and using real cooks. Okay, so that's what I had to present today, and really, the message, the takeaway is that carbon financing is really the main source of support for our sector these days in terms of getting cleaner cooking technologies and fuels into households. And so it's really something that we should take advantage of as much as we can. But in order for that to be productive, we may need to make and respected, we need to make sure that we're using quality data from the field. And the better data that we have and the more traceable it is and verifiable it is, the more money the buyers are willing to pay for those emission reductions. And so hopefully many of you on the call are going to be able to help us with that and help projects to get the great field data and help them secure the higher value emission reductions. So Aprovecho is here to help the labs and our TKCs to learn what they need to provide that support to the many projects that are starting or ongoing around the world. And so that's why we've launched this webinar series. The Osprey Foundation gave us some funding to support you all at no cost to individual labs. So please make best use of those services. We'll have another webinar in 3 weeks that'll hopefully build off of what we've talked about today, because we're talking about field testing. So she'll go into more details about the control cooking test and the kitchen performance test. So that hopefully will be helpful. This QR code provides the meeting invitation to that. So feel free to join there if you would like. And just wanted to, thank you all for joining. And now we can open the floor to questions. I'd love to answer any questions you may have. Camille, hi. Nice to see you. Okay, what's your question?
Okay, thank you very much for organizing such an interesting presentation on carbon finance. I have just two questions.
Great.
One is about the IoT cost. If possible, it would be nice to know the current prices of the IoTs or SAMs, so that really does it worth to implement it, especially for improved cookstoves. That's one question that I have.
Okay.
And then the other one is about the 2 tons of CO2, the maximum figure that has been set in the clear. I mean, from the previous estimations, it seems very low. So I don't know how was this has been reached. I mean, 2 tons is relatively very small. So do we have a kind of justification for that?
I don't quite understand that question, Camille. Can you be a little bit more specific?
He thinks it's 2 tons of CO2. I think it's 2 tons of fuel wood.
Okay.
Ah.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah,
Okay.
so that's 2 tons of fuel wood per household, per person per year. So, and that's the maximum. But the emission reduction is actually then what was that baseline minus the project. So what you would measure at the project, and then you would multiply that still by the emission factors. So it's a bit.
2 tons of fuel wood is about 4.5 kgs per person per day, I think.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. So we could explore the math, or maybe I can do a part 2 someday of actually looking through the math and doing examples. But yeah, and then your other question, Camille, was how much do the sensors cost? And that varies. I'm not sure about Geoscene. I know that Olivier at Climate Solutions Consulting is rents some of the sensors. Like the fuel sensors are mostly rented, and I think it's like $20 per quarter to rent a fuel sensor. And then the temperature sensors, I don't have off the top of my head, but they, I think, are under $10. And so if we've done the math in the past, and depending on how expensive your field time is, it can be the same for purchasing the sensors or renting the sensors versus the additional investment in field staff time. Because for the KPT, without sensors, you have to go to the household every day. So you have to send people to the household every day. Whereas when you use the sensors, you only have to go at the beginning and end to install the sensors. So depending on your sample sizes and your field team costs, it could be more advantageous to use the sensors. But yeah, so I know that Olivier is really working to get those costs down as low as possible.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Camille. Hi, Larry. Thanks for raising your hand. What's your question? Looks like you're still muted, Larry. Oh, yep, we can hear you now.
Oh, okay. So you're cooking electrically.
Uh-huh.
Do you look at how much CO2 is put in the air to make the electricity? Like you could be burning fossil fuels, or you could use solar.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. That shows up in this equation here. So if you're doing grid electricity with fossil fuels, right, you look at how much energy you use times the emission factor of, how much CO2 is put into the atmosphere through that fossil fuel grid source, or if you're doing off-grid, like solar energy, you can do the same thing for the off-grid. So this is the off-grid portion, and here's the grid portion, and either one is accounted for in the emission factors for that, whichever the source is.
Great. Thank you. That's
You're
great.
welcome. Yeah, thanks for your question. Any other questions? Joseph?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question is, I've looked through all the calculations and the formulas. I don't know, and I was wondering if the black carbon is inclusive in the calculations.
That's a fantastic question, Joseph. Right now, the equations only include the Kyoto gases, which is carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and N2O. But black carbon really isn't something that fits well into those sort of non-CO2 emission factors, because it behaves much differently in the atmosphere. But the good news is that folks are working on methods to account for black carbon in a different way, kind of like an add-on. Like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with ADALIs, or like the separate way of kind of calculating for health benefits, but they are looking at creating a different kind of methodology and calculation metric for black carbon that could add on to these emission reductions, but it wouldn't be embedded or a part of these calculations themselves. I hope that answers your question. But I'm a huge proponent of finding ways to account for black carbon in our projects, because that's a huge, I mean, black carbon and particulate matter go hand in hand, right? And so stoves that protect health and climate are the ones that reduce PM emissions and also black carbon emissions, but we don't account for PM emissions at all. We only account for the gaseous emissions. And so this means that really the only thing that projects need to focus on is increasing thermal efficiency, not combustion efficiency. So not reducing the smoke or the PM black carbon emissions. And so I would really love to see our sector move in the direction of being able to somehow monetize and account for the health aspects. Otherwise, we're not being incentivized to make clean burning stoves, at least for wood and charcoal, which I think is really important. Yeah, thanks for your question. Any other questions? I know we're at time, so I want to be respectful of people's time, but I'm here and would love to talk more if anybody has other questions.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. It was really informative. I have a question regarding sums. So I kind of actually got an opportunity to see them, and I was wondering how they would operate on a stove when it's in use and with fire and so on, like the durability of it. So I was wondering if there would be some kind of margin to count for the defaults or the broken sums, because this might be potentially a problem in the coming future, where if you have 10,000 of stoves and sums, and some of them might stop working, and you wouldn't really have an idea to know if it's working or not until you kind of go back and look at the data and you realize that, oh, it was not measuring the data since 2 months.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So there's a couple different types of sums that work differently, right? One has a thermocouple on a wire so that the electronics can be put far away from the fire to reduce that problem of potentially overheating or melting or whatever. Another one uses infrared, and so you kind of put it on a stick away from the fire and point at it. So some of the designs and the installation instructions are designed to protect those devices as much as possible. But the reality is some will get destroyed for a variety of reasons. And so I think the companies that distribute those do recommend some sort of margin. I don't know exactly what it is. I think it might be between 5 and 10%. But yeah, that's a good point, and something that should be built into the project. But that's not prescribed in CLEAR. But CLEAR does say, you need to have 100 kBTs and 200 surveys. So you want to make sure that you plan, maybe you make more measurements than that, so that if you do have to throw out some data, you'll still have that, meet that minimum requirement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks. That's a good question. Hi, Mike.
Yeah, if we have time. Do you know? I mean, do you know if gold standard is just have its own little, like, so clear? Does it have a? What's the plan for being incorporated into the validation bodies? Because like I know Vera and gold standard so far haven't adopted it. Do you know if there's anything conversing with that?
Yeah, I was just talking with Alyssa about this recently, and I think that they're very close. They've gone through, public commenting periods and revisions and things, and so I think from what I gathered, they're at kind of the last stages before gold standard adopts. And I can, it would be great to get an official update, but yeah, I think we're pretty close, but still not quite there.
Cool.
Yeah. But yeah, that's the idea. Like CLEAR was designed to be adopted by these governing bodies so that we have this unified approach that's similar, because currently like the different governing bodies, Vera and Gold Standard and UNFCCC, have different options for methodologies, and that's kind of what's creating a lot of the confusion. So the ideal situation is that they would all adopt CLEAR, which has not yet happened, but they're moving closer.
Also, do you know if there's a resource for the 90-10 evaluation? I think because I've worked with you guys, I've actually worked with another guy right now, and there's different answers. The different statisticians have come up with me of whether I have 90-10 confidence in our KPTs. And so I don't know if there is a sheet out there, an accepted sheet. You can say you put your results into this, and they'll tell you whether it's 90-10.
I don't know about a spreadsheet, but there's an appendix to CLEAR that has the details of how you would calculate that.
Oh, cool. I don't think I saw that.
I can send it to you if you want.
Well, if it's in CLEAR, I have that. So.
Okay. Shelby, I think I saw that you put in chat if I would share the slides, and absolutely, yes, I will post the slides on the Aprovecho website at some point, or once we get the recording posted. So you'll all be able to download those there.
Thank you.
Welcome. Any last questions? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you again so much, all of you, for joining. This was a wonderful turnout, and let us know if we can support you in any way. That's what we're here for, and really excited that we're moving in the right direction as a global community toward clean cooking. So best wishes on all of your work, and thank you all for the work that you do.
Thanks, Nordica.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Nordica. All. Thank you.
Thank you.